My name is David Osei. I am 44 years old. I have a PhD in aerospace engineering from MIT. I hold patents on 3 propulsion system components currently used in commercial satellite launches. And I run a research and development company in Houston that employs 31 engineers and scientists and holds contracts with 2 major aerospace companies and 1 federal agency. My father came to America from Ghana in 1976 with a suitcase and a determination that I have spent my entire life trying to understand and honor. He worked as a janitor for 7 years while studying for his accounting certification at night, and he built a life with my mother that was stable and warm and full of love and governed by a belief in hard work and education that was so complete and so consistent that I absorbed it before I had the language to describe what I was absorbing. I am telling you all of this because the story I want to tell you is not primarily about aerospace engineering or patents or federal contracts. It is about what happens when a child inherits everything a parent built and then builds something the parent cannot recognize, and what the distance between recognition and understanding costs both of them, and what it takes to close that distance over the course of a lifetime. It is also about a specific evening at a conference in Cape Canaveral in 2021, when my father sat in an audience of 200 aerospace professionals and watched a presentation I gave on propulsion system optimization, and understood for the first time, at the age of 73, what his son had actually been doing for the previous 20 years. The understanding arrived late. It arrived completely. And what happened between the two of us in the parking lot afterward, in the Florida evening with the smell of salt water in the air, is the conversation I have been building toward for longer than I knew. My father, Emmanuel Osei, arrived in America at 24 with $42, which he has told me about so many times over the course of my life that I can describe the denominations, 2 20s and 2 1s, and the feel of the wallet they were in, which was a brown leather bifold his own father had given him on the day he left Accra. He had a cousin in New York who let him sleep on a couch for the first 3 months. He found work as a building janitor through a church connection, and he worked that job for 7 years, the night shift, and during the day he studied. His study was not casual preparation for a comfortable certification. It was the study of a man who understood that education was the mechanism through which everything else he wanted to accomplish would become possible, and who treated it accordingly, with total seriousness, 0 shortcuts, and a patience that I now recognize as one of the most remarkable qualities a person can possess. He passed his CPA exam on the first attempt in 1984. He got his first accounting job at a small firm in Brooklyn. He married my mother Abina in 1978, 2 years after arriving, and they had me in 1980 and my sister Amma in 1983, and they raised us in a Queens apartment that was small and warm and full of the particular density of a household where every object had been chosen carefully because every dollar had been earned carefully. I grew up understanding that nothing was free and everything was possible, and that the distance between those 2 facts was filled by work. This is an excellent foundation for an engineer. It is also occasionally a limitation for a father who has defined the parameters of what possible looks like so specifically that something falling outside those parameters can look, for a long time, like failure. My interest in aerospace started at 12, with a school trip to the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum in New York. I had been interested in math and physics before that trip in the general way that children who are good at math and physics are interested in them, as subjects, as puzzles, as things that come easily and therefore feel satisfying. After that trip, the interest became specific. I stood in front of a Saturn V rocket engine display and felt something shift in me that I do not have better language for than that. A shift, a reorientation, a sense of having found the direction I had been facing without knowing I was facing it. I went home and got a library card for the science library and started reading everything I could find about propulsion systems. I was 12 years old. I read things I could not fully understand and understood them partially and came back for more. My father watched this with a careful interest that was supportive without being fully comfortable, because my father's model of professional success was built from what he knew: accounting, finance, the recognized professions that had been available to Ghanaian immigrants building stability in America in the 1970s and 1980s. Aerospace was not in that model. He did not say this explicitly to me. He said it in the quality of his questions, which were always about whether there was a clear path and whether people who did this work were well compensated and whether there were jobs at the end of the training. These are reasonable questions. They are the questions of a man who had earned everything he had through a path that was demanding but clear. The answers to his questions about aerospace were complicated, and complicated answers made my father thoughtful in ways that could read. To a 12-year-old who needed encouragement. As doubt, I went to Cornell for my undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering, which my father accepted with genuine pride and which my mother celebrated with the kind of elaborate dinner that in my family marks the occasions that matter most. Cornell was excellent, and I was excellent at Cornell. And the 4 years were among the most intellectually alive of my life. The introduction to real engineering problems, the laboratory work, the professors who were doing things that mattered, and who treated undergraduates who showed real curiosity as colleagues rather than students. I called home every Sunday. My father asked about grades and classes and whether I was eating properly. He did not ask much about the specific content of what I was studying, because the content was becoming too specialized for our conversations to easily accommodate it, which was the beginning of a gap that would widen considerably in the years to come. I was admitted to MIT's aerospace PhD program after Cornell, which was and remains one of the best programs in the world, and which represented to me the clear next step in a direction I had been moving since I was 12 years old. To my father, it represented another 4 to 6 years of school followed by a career in something he did not fully understand, which was a different thing from a bad outcome, but was also not the outcome he had been picturing. He supported it. He never told me not to go, but I could feel in the quality of his support that he was holding something back. Not love, never love, but a specific kind of endorsement that required him to understand the thing he was endorsing. And he did not yet understand it well enough to offer that endorsement fully. MIT was transformative in the way that the best educational experiences are transformative, which is to say, it did not so much teach me things I did not know as it remade the architecture of how I thought about the things I knew. My advisor was a woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, who had done foundational work on propulsion systems and who had a gift for identifying the specific question inside a large problem and focusing attention on it with a precision that was almost surgical. She saw something in my dissertation, work on combustion efficiency in low-thrust propulsion systems, that she said she had not seen before, and she did not say this to flatter me. She said it in the specific way of a scientist describing an observation, which is to say as a factual statement about data rather than a judgment about the person who had produced it. The dissertation led to my first patent application at 27, which was filed with the help of the university's technology licensing office, and which I called my father to tell him about. He was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he asked what a patent meant in practical terms, meaning what did it produce and how much did it pay, and was it a job? I explained that it was intellectual property protection for a specific technical innovation, and that the licensing revenue depended on whether companies chose to use the technology and that the immediate financial return was not the point. He said he understood. I did not think he did, but I did not know how to bridge the gap in that phone call, and I let it go. And the letting it go became a pattern that lasted for many years. I want to tell you about the specific technical work, not in great detail because this is not a technical document, but in enough detail for you to understand what I have been doing and why it matters to me. Propulsion systems are, in simplified terms, the mechanisms by which things move through space. They take fuel and convert it into thrust through chemical reactions that are governed by physics that is fully understood in principle and partially understood in practice, which means that improving them requires not just applying known formulas, but doing the work of closing the gap between what the equations predict and what actually happens in the extremely complex environments of combustion, chambers operating under the conditions of spaceflight. The gap between prediction and reality is where most of the interesting engineering happens. I have spent my career in that gap, specifically in the domain of low-thrust propulsion systems, the kind used for satellite positioning and station keeping, which are the small continuous adjustments that keep a satellite in the correct orbit over many years. The work is not glamorous in the way that rocket launches are glamorous. It is precise and slow, and requires the kind of sustained attention to detail that is either your natural mode of operation or something you have to work very hard to develop. It is my natural mode of operation. It is also, I have come to understand, a quality I inherited from my father, who applied the same precision to accounting that I apply to combustion dynamics, the same fundamental belief that the details are where the truth is and that getting them right is not optional. The company I started in 2008 came out of a conversation with a former colleague from my postdoctoral work at JPL, a woman named Sarah Kimura who had a background in material science and who had been thinking about the intersection of materials properties and propulsion efficiency in ways that overlapped productively with my own research. We had lunch at a restaurant in Pasadena and spent 3 hours drawing on napkins and talking about a specific problem in solid fuel propulsion that we both thought was solvable if you approached it from the materials side rather than the combustion side. I drove home that afternoon and called my father, which is something I do when something significant happens. Not because the calls always go well, but because he is my father and I have always wanted him to know what is happening. I told him I was thinking about starting a company. He asked what kind of company. I said a research and development company focused on propulsion systems. He asked how you made money from research and development. I explained the contract model. Companies and agencies pay you to solve specific technical problems, and you patent what you develop, and the licensing adds to the contract revenue. He asked about the risk. I said it was significant. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since, not because it was encouraging and not because it was discouraging, but because it was honest in a way that my father's statements always were. He said, "David, I did not come to this country to raise a son who is afraid of work. I am not afraid of your risk. I am afraid of your clarity. Are you clear?" I said I was clear. He said, "Then go ahead." That was the whole conversation. The company's first 3 years were defined by a specific kind of difficulty that I want to describe accurately, because the accurate version is more useful than the simplified version. The difficulty was not primarily financial, though the financial pressure was real. The difficulty was the gap between the timeline of serious research and the timeline of contract deliverables, which are often misaligned in ways that require constant negotiation and that create stress for both the researchers and the clients. We were trying to do work that took the time it took in an environment that required results on a schedule that did not account for what the work actually required. I managed this gap through a combination of over-delivering on what we could deliver on schedule and being aggressively honest about what we could not deliver on schedule and why, which is not the approach that maximizes short-term contract renewal rates, but is the approach that builds the kind of long-term relationships with clients who understand what serious research requires and who come back because they trust your honesty more than your optimism. Sarah and I hired our first 3 employees in year 2, 2 engineers and 1 person to handle the administrative and financial operations. A woman named Grace, who had a background in government contracting, and who turned out to be one of the best hires I have ever made in terms of the ratio of value added to the quality signals available at the time of hiring. My father asked about her at our next Sunday call, and I told him about her background, and he said it sounded like I had found someone who understood the operational side. And I said yes, and he said good. The operational side is where organizations fail, which is both true and the kind of thing that only a person who has spent a career in financial management would say. My mother Abina has been a consistent and clear presence throughout this story in a way that I have not fully articulated, and she deserves more than a supporting role in this narrative, because her understanding of my work predated my father's by many years and was arrived at through a different method. My mother is not an engineer or a scientist. She retired from a career as a social worker after 30 years, which gave her a particular kind of understanding of human systems and motivations that I think is more relevant to the story I am telling than it might initially appear. She understood my work not because she understood the technical content. She has always been honest about the limits of her technical understanding, but because she understood that I was doing something with the seriousness and dedication that her husband had applied to his own career, and that the outward form of the work being unfamiliar did not change the quality of the commitment she recognized in me. She said this to me once when I was in my early 30s, in a kitchen conversation during a Christmas visit, and she said it simply and directly in the way she said most things. She said she could not tell you what a propulsion system was, but she could tell you that the way I worked reminded her of the way my father had worked when he was studying for his accounting exam, and that whatever produced that quality of work was worth taking seriously. I have held on to that observation for over a decade. It is the closest thing I have to a family theory of what I inherited and why. The second patent came in 2013 and the third in 2017, and with the third one came a shift in the organization's profile that I had been working toward, but had not been certain would happen on any particular timeline. The third patent covered a specific design modification to a thrust vector control system that solved a problem that several companies in the commercial satellite sector had been working on for years, and the licensing of that patent to two of those companies in the same year generated revenue that changed the organization's financial picture in a way that allowed us to hire at a pace we had not previously been able to sustain. We went from 11 employees to 23 in 2 years. We moved from our original office space, a converted warehouse in the Clear Lake area of Houston, near the Johnson Space Center, which I had chosen for the proximity to the aerospace community and which was less glamorous than any photograph of it would suggest, to a purpose-built facility that was still modest by the standards of larger aerospace companies, but which had the specific infrastructure that serious propulsion research requires, which includes test equipment and safety systems that are not cheap and cannot be improvised. My father came to see the new facility when we moved in. He walked through it with me on a Saturday morning in October, and I tried to explain what each piece of equipment was for and what we were working on with it. He asked good questions, not technically sophisticated questions, but the questions of a careful man who was trying to understand the landscape of a place that was important to his son. He said it looked like serious work. That was the description he used. Serious work. It was not the language I would have chosen, but it was language I recognized as his version of approval, which is a currency I had learned to accept in the denominations in which it was offered. I want to talk about what it was like to be a black aerospace engineer building a company in Houston in the 2010s, because it is relevant to the story, and because leaving it out would be an omission that distorts the accuracy of what I am describing. The aerospace industry has a diversity problem that is well documented and that I experienced in specific and sometimes difficult ways throughout my career. At MIT, there were very few black students in the aerospace program, and the implicit assumption that we were outliers rather than simply engineers was something I navigated constantly, usually without mentioning it, because mentioning it required spending energy I needed for the work. In the professional context, the navigation continued in different forms. The assumption at conferences that I was someone's graduate student rather than the speaker. The clients who seemed surprised by my technical depth in early conversations. The investors who applied a skepticism to our business model that I observed was less consistently applied to comparable companies, led by white engineers. I am not telling you this to elicit sympathy or to suggest that these experiences defined my career, because they did not define it. The work defined it. I am telling you because it is true, and because my father had navigated similar dynamics in accounting and had never talked about them directly with me, and because we had a conversation about this in 2015 that was the first honest conversation we had ever had about race in our professional lives. He told me that he had learned early that the work had to be twice as good, and the presentation had to be twice as clean, and the relationships had to be built twice as carefully, and that this was wrong, but it was the reality he had operated in, and that he had decided not to spend energy resenting what he could not change when that energy was needed for building. I told him I had learned the same things, from his example more than from anything he had said explicitly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was glad the example had been useful, which was as close to acknowledging his parental role in my formation as he had come in a direct conversation in my adult life. The federal contract that came in 2018 was the most significant professional validation the company had received to that point, and I want to describe it accurately because the accurate description illuminates something about how the work actually gets recognized in the aerospace sector. The agency, which I will not name for reasons of contractual confidentiality, was looking for a research partner to work on a specific problem in propulsion efficiency for a class of small satellites that were being developed for a national security application. They had evaluated 17 companies over a period of 14 months. We were not the largest of the 17 or the most established or the one with the most recognizable name. We were selected, as the contracting officer explained in the debrief, because our proposed methodology was the most technically credible, and because our track record on prior deliverables demonstrated the kind of reliability that a national security application required. The contract was for 4 years and the dollar value was significant. I called my father the evening we were notified. He asked what the contract was for. I said I could not tell him all of the details because of the confidentiality requirements, but that it was a federal agency and that it was for 4 years and that it was the largest contract we had received. He asked if it was a real federal agency. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "David, I want you to know that I understand you have been doing something serious. I have not always understood what it was, but I have seen you do it. This is a good day. It was the most direct acknowledgement of my work he had ever given me, and I sat with it for a long time after we hung up. The Cape Canaveral conference in 2021 was the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics Annual Technical Conference, which is one of the most significant gatherings in the aerospace field, and which I had attended many times as a presenter and as an audience member. I had been asked to give a plenary session presentation on the research that had led to the third patent and its applications, which was a significant invitation because plenary sessions at AIAA go to people who have done work that the field considers important enough to present to the full conference, rather than to a specialized session. I had given major presentations before and was comfortable on stage in the way that people who present technical material regularly become comfortable. Not the comfort of someone who enjoys performance, but the specific comfort of someone who knows the material completely and trusts the knowing. 2 weeks before the conference, I called my father and told him about the presentation, and told him where it was, and told him I would like him to be there. He had never attended a professional event of mine. He was 73 years old and his health was good, and he lived in Queens, which is a manageable distance from Florida. He said he would think about it. 4 days later, he called me back and said he had booked a flight. I did not make a big deal of this. I said I was glad, but it mattered to me more than I told him at the time. The morning of the presentation, my father sat in the first row of the plenary hall, which seats approximately 400 people, and he was the best-dressed person in the room by a significant margin, which is consistent with who my father is and has always been. He wore the dark blue suit he wore to important occasions and a tie that my mother had given him for their anniversary, and he sat with the posture of a man who was somewhere significant, and was taking the significance seriously. I could see him from the side of the stage where I was waiting to be introduced. He was looking at the program, reading the description of my presentation, which is not something the people who knew my work needed to do, but which was exactly what my father needed to do. I watched him read it, and I watched him finish reading it, and I watched him look up at the stage where I was about to speak. The session chair introduced me, the standard academic introduction, listing the institutional affiliations and the publications and the patents, and I walked out to the podium. I gave the presentation. It was 70 minutes long, and it covered the theoretical foundation of the work, the experimental methodology, the results, and the implications for future research and applications. I had given a version of it twice before at smaller venues, but this was the full version, the complete account of what we had spent 8 years building toward. The audience of aerospace professionals responded the way aerospace professionals respond to a good technical presentation, which is with quiet, focused attention and specific questions during the Q&A. It was, by the measures of this kind of event, a very good presentation. When I came off the stage, my father was standing near the exit with his program in his hand. We went out to the parking lot because the reception inside was loud and my father wanted to talk and we needed somewhere quiet. It was early evening in Cape Canaveral, and the air smelled of salt water, and the sky had the specific quality of a Florida coastal sky in the late afternoon, which is a deeper blue than you see inland, and which I associate with the launches I had watched from this part of the state over many years of coming to this conference. My father stood next to me and he was quiet for a moment in the way he is quiet before he says something he has prepared carefully. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Okay." He said that he had understood, when he walked into that room and sat down and read the program, that he had not understood. That he had known I was doing serious work, had known it for years, had said so in the few direct moments we had had about it. But understanding that something is serious and understanding what the seriousness consists of are different things, and what he had experienced for the previous 70 minutes was the second kind of understanding arriving for the first time. He said he had followed the presentation in the way that a person follows something, complex when they are paying complete attention on not understanding every technical detail but understanding the shape of the work, the scope of it, the quality of it. The fact that 200 of the most qualified people in the field in the world had been in that room and had received what I presented with the specific kind of engaged respect that experts have for other experts. He said he understood now what I had been doing. He said more than that, and I want to tell you the rest because the rest is the part that has stayed with me most clearly. He said that when he had come to this country in 1976, he had known exactly what he was building toward and had been able to describe it to anyone who asked: a stable life, a recognized profession, a family with security. He had built that. And he said that I had built something that he could not have described when I started building it, and could only now see in its completed form, and that his inability to describe it in advance had made him cautious in ways that he now understood had been less about my work and more about his own discomfort with a territory he could not map in advance. He said he had been afraid that if he fully endorsed something he did not understand, he might be endorsing something that would not protect me, and that his entire professional life had been organized around the principle of protecting what he had built by understanding it completely before committing to it. He said he recognized now that this principle, which had been exactly right for the specific circumstances of his own life and his own career, was not a universal principle, and that applying it to my life had been a failure of adaptation. He had used the right tool in the wrong context. He said this clearly and directly and without any of the evasion that these kinds of admissions often contain. I stood next to him in the Cape Canaveral parking lot, and I felt the weight of 20 years of the distance between us begin to shift. I want to be honest about what I said in response, because the honest version is less tidy than the version I sometimes tell when I am describing this conversation to other people. I did not immediately say it was fine, or that I understood, or that I did not hold the distance against him. What I said first was that I needed a moment, and I took it. I walked a few steps away and looked at the water that was visible past the edge of the parking lot and let the weight of what he had said land fully before I responded. And what I felt, standing there in the Florida evening, was something I can only describe as a combination of grief and relief that came at the same time and from the same source. The grief was for the years of the gap, for the conversations we had not had, for the endorsements I had not received at the moments when I had needed them most, for the particular loneliness of doing significant work in a field your family cannot access, and having that loneliness be the texture of your professional life for 2 decades. The relief was for this, for the parking lot, for the directness of what he had said, for the fact that we were having this conversation at all, and that he had chosen to have it with the same honesty he brought to everything. I walked back to where he was standing. I told him that I had needed him to see it and that waiting for him to see it had cost something, and that I wanted him to know that not because I wanted him to feel guilty, but because the truth was that it had cost something and I was not going to pretend otherwise. He nodded. He said he understood that this was true. We stood there together in the evening air for a while longer. Then we went back inside. My sister Amma has been largely absent from this story, and I want to address that directly because her absence is not an omission of convenience, but a reflection of a different relationship, dynamic that deserves its own acknowledgement. Amma is 2 years younger than me. She became a physician, a cardiologist, which was, in the architecture of my parents' expectations, the closest approximation to what they had hoped one of their children would achieve. She is excellent at it. She is one of the best cardiologists in her hospital system in Atlanta, and she has the specific combination of technical precision and genuine care for her patients that distinguishes exceptional physicians from merely competent ones. My parents were proud of her in a way that was more legible to them from the beginning. Medicine is a recognized profession. Its prestige is understood across cultural contexts. Its utility is immediately apparent. I was not jealous of this, or not primarily. I understood it and accepted it as the product of the framework they had brought to evaluating success. And the framework was not wrong in itself, only in its application as a singular standard. Amma and I have always been close in the specific way of siblings, who chose very different paths and who are each other's best evidence that the same parents and the same household can produce entirely different kinds of excellence. She attended the Cape Canaveral conference for the day of my presentation, and she asked me afterward whether I had told Dad before his speech how comprehensive it was going to be. I said no. She said she thought that was probably the right call, that he needed to see it without being prepared to see it. She was right. The company has continued to grow in the years since Cape Canaveral, and I want to give you the current picture because this story does not have a neat ending. It has a current state, which is what actual lives have rather than the conclusions that narratives require. We now have 31 employees. We have 4 active federal contracts and 2 commercial contracts. We are working on a 4th patent application that covers a component of a novel liquid fuel propulsion system that I believe will be significant when we complete the validation process. Though I have learned enough about the gap between prediction and validation to hold that belief with appropriate humility. Sarah Kimura, who was there at the beginning with the napkins in the Pasadena restaurant, is now the company's chief technology officer and the person I trust most in the world with the technical direction of the work. Grace, who handled the administrative side from year 2, is now the chief operating officer and runs the organizational functions with a competence that makes my own management feel, by comparison, quite ordinary. I hired well in the early years, which is the most important thing a founder can do, and which I did partly by instinct and partly by asking people I respected who they would hire, and listening carefully to their answers. The organization reflects the people in it, which is to say it is more than what I would have built alone. My father retired in 2019 at 71, which is later than most people retire and consistent with who he is. A man who worked because he needed to work, not primarily for financial reasons, but because the work was the expression of the self that had been built over decades of discipline and precision, and the satisfaction of doing something difficult correctly. He and my mother live in Queens in the apartment they moved into when I was in high school, and which they have lived in for more than 30 years. He reads, he walks. He watches the news with the same critical attention he brought to everything else. He calls me every Sunday, which is the pattern we established when I left for college, and which has continued without interruption for over 25 years. The calls are better now, longer, more substantive, more able to go below the surface of the logistics of life into the actual conversation that, too, people who respect each other can have when they are no longer maintaining a distance that neither of them has quite acknowledged. He asks about the work in ways that reflect real curiosity rather than the polite maintenance of connection. He asks about specific projects and about the people doing them, and about the problems we are trying to solve. He does not always understand the technical answers, but he understands the shape of the work and the quality of the commitment behind it. And understanding those things is the form of understanding that matters between a father and a son who have chosen very different fields. I want to say something about mentorship because it is relevant to this story in a way I have not yet addressed. Throughout my career, particularly in the early years when I was navigating an industry that did not look much like me and building an organization with no template for what I was building, I received help from people who saw something in me and chose to invest their time and attention in my development. Dr. Patricia Huang at MIT was the first of these. Dr. James Okafor at JPL, who was one of the few Black senior engineers I encountered in my postdoctoral years and who took me to lunch twice and told me things about navigating the aerospace industry that are not written anywhere and that I would not have learned any other way. A program officer at one of our early grant-making foundations named Carol Park, who told me that the proposal was technically excellent and that if I wanted her to fund it, I needed to rewrite the organizational capacity section because it did not demonstrate that I could manage an organization as well as I could design a propulsion system, and who gave me 2 weeks to revise it. I revised it. She funded it. These people made a difference that I cannot quantify and that I try to honor by doing the same for the people I can reach. We have had 6 MIT PhD students complete rotations at our company. I have mentored 12 engineers in various stages of their careers through formal and informal relationships. This is not charity. It is the payment of a debt that was incurred with people who are no longer available to receive the payment directly, which means it has to flow forward. The conversation about what I inherited from my father is one I have been having internally for most of my adult life, and the Cape Canaveral evening gave it a different quality because it moved from internal to shared. What I inherited was not a technical framework. My father and I work in entirely different technical domains. What I inherited was a set of operating principles that are domain independent and that I have applied to aerospace engineering with the same results that he applied them to accounting. The first principle is that the details are where the truth is. My father audited books with a precision that found errors that other auditors had missed, not because he had better tools, but because he did not accept approximation in any detail that could be made exact. I approach combustion chamber design with the same refusal of approximation. The second principle is that relationships are built by being reliable and being honest, and in that order. My father built a client base in accounting over 30 years by doing exactly what he said he would do by the time he said he would do it, and by telling clients things they did not want to hear when those things were true. I have built the company on the same foundation, and the clients who have been with us for more than 5 years are there because they trust us more than they trust the organizations that sometimes have better resources, but do not have the same consistency of honesty. The third principle is that the work is its own argument. My father never tried to convince anyone that accounting was important. He just did it so well that the importance was apparent. I have tried to do the same with propulsion research.
My mother came to Houston last spring for a visit that lasted 2 weeks, which is longer than any visit she had made before, and which was possible because my father is healthy and comfortable in Queens for 2 weeks, and because she had decided she wanted to spend time with me in my own environment rather than in the environment of family gatherings that are organized around occasions. She came to the office. She attended our weekly research meeting, sitting in the corner with the polite attentiveness she brought to context she found unfamiliar. She met Sarah and Grace and several of the engineers. She asked questions of everyone she met that revealed a genuine interest in who they were and why they were doing this work, which is a social skill she has always possessed and which comes from her career in social work, where understanding people's motivations is not optional. At the end of the visit we had dinner at a restaurant I had been to many times, and she ordered the fish and I ordered the beef, and we talked for 3 hours about things we had not talked about before. She told me about a client she had worked with in her last year before retirement, a man who had been trying to keep his family together under circumstances that were very difficult, and about what it had felt like to watch him succeed partially and fail partially, and what it had taught her about what success actually looks like in the granular version rather than the outcome version. I told her about the 4th patent work and what we were trying to do and why we thought it was possible. She listened to both of these things with the same quality of attention, which told me something I had suspected for a long time, that she had always understood that my work and her work were the same kind of thing, which is the careful application of expertise to problems that matter, and that the surface differences in content had never been the obstacle to her understanding. The obstacle had been the gap between what mattered to her husband and what mattered to her son, and watching that gap begin to close had allowed her own understanding to become visible. There is something I have not said yet about the day in the parking lot in Cape Canaveral, and I want to say it because it is the part that is hardest to articulate and also the most important. After my father said what he said about his failure of adaptation, and after I said what I said about the cost of the distance, we stood in the parking lot for another few minutes and neither of us said much. And then my father did something he had not done since I was a child. He put his hand on my shoulder, not a handshake grip, not the brief contact of a man who is not demonstrative, but a real hand on a real shoulder, the weight of it intentional. He kept it there for a moment. Then he said something I have thought about every day since and that I will probably think about for the rest of my life. He said, "Your grandfather would have known from the beginning." He meant his own father, Emmanuel Sr., who had died before I was born and who I knew only from photographs and from my father's stories. He was saying that his father, who had grown up in Ghana during a time when the specific mechanisms of the future were not visible but the quality of attention required to build something was, would have recognized in me the thing that he himself had taken 20 years to see. He was saying, without saying it directly, that the delay in his recognition was his own limitation and not a verdict on the work. He was saying, I think, that whatever the specific technical content of my work, the patents, the contracts, the propulsion systems, what he was proud of was the quality of the commitment, and that quality was the thing he had given me and that his father had given him and that I would give, if I was lucky, to whatever came next. I am 44 years old. My company has been operating for 16 years. We have 31 employees doing work that I believe matters. My father is 76. He calls me every Sunday. The calls are the best part of the week. We talk about the work, mine and his memory of his, and we talk about my mother and my sister and the people in our family and the things happening in the world. We talk about Ghana, which my father visits every 2 years and which I have visited 3 times and which is a place I understand as the source of the particular combination of discipline and pride and high expectation that formed my father and through him formed me. We do not talk about the gap in the way that people talk about something they are still working through. The gap is part of the history of our relationship and the history is finished. What we have now is not a repaired version of what we had before, it is a new thing, built from what we each understand the other to be, which is an understanding that required the evidence of the actual lives we have lived. My father understands what I do. Not in every technical detail, He could not pass an aerospace engineering exam, and the gap in technical knowledge between a propulsion researcher and a retired CPA is not going to close in any number of Sunday phone calls. But he understands the work the way he understands anything important, in terms of the seriousness of the commitment and the quality of the execution and the significance of the outcome. He understands that I built something real. He understands that it required everything I had for a long time. And he has said, in several different conversations over the past 3 years, that he is proud of me in the complete way that parents hope to be proud of children, and that sometimes takes longer than anyone would choose for the pride to become legible. I am glad it became legible. I am glad we are here. I intend to call him on Sunday and tell him about a development in the 4th patent work that I think will interest him, and he will ask the right questions, and we will talk for a long time. And that is the life we have built together across 44 years and 2 continents and 1 parking lot in Cape Canaveral where the sky was exactly the right shade of blue.